So let's get a feel for what you guys are familiar with. How many people have used React before? Just about everybody. Okay. How many people have used React hooks before? Cool, quite a few. Great. So as we go along, let me know if you have questions. We can kind of go in as beginner or as in-depth as you want. I don't have an exact presentation. It's kind of a last-minute thing, but I've been working with hooks a lot and want everybody to know about them. So I think the first thing to understand about hooks is what the alternative is. So, you know, from React stage 1, we are using classes to render things. And into your class, you have two ways the information can come in. One's a state and one's props. And so you still have that with pure functional components, but let's talk about what the difference is. So it's not necessary to actually see and tell what all the code is, but you can imagine this is a class, a React component class, and inside it you have a constructor where you receive the props, you set your initial state, and you set up the functions that you want to handle, so things like on-change events from inputs, and then at the end, you know, this has a render function where it returns some HTML. So the concept here is that when you change this kind of component into a pure component that uses hooks, this is what kind of happens. So there's going to be 3 areas that are highlighted, and they're kind of different concerns that you'd have. And one of them, the biggest one, is the render or the actual HTML that you want to output. And so this kind of just illustrates from a quick glance what is happening when you transition into something that is using hooks. So you can see that the main idea here is that previously some of these concerns you had all mixed together in different functions inside the class. And the React hook structure lets you put all of those next to each other. So if nothing else, that's kind of the idea of the benefit, is putting concerns next to each other. So we'll talk about some more benefits coming up as well. So this is hopefully something we can see. It's a simple example of that. So React component, we've got props that come in, we have state, and we have one thing that can be triggered from the view, which is this change event. And the change is actually just an input here. So anytime somebody types something into this input, this on-change handler is going to fire, and we're going to say this.setState. And when you run this, anytime that the props change, it'll re-render, and anytime this.setState is called, it will re-render. So this is a really basic, you know, component. It's just got an H1, an input, and a P. And let's look at how to do the exact same thing in hooks or in a pure component. So previously, you could use pure components, which is just a function instead of a class. And the props come in, it doesn't show this in this example, but the props would come in as arguments in an object. So you destructure what you cared about, what props you cared about. And then inside here, it's a really similar situation here for the actual JSX or the actual view. One difference is instead of this.state and this.onChange and this.state value, down here in our view we just have value and onChange and value. So that's the second kind of benefit, right, is that there's less to type, there's less to worry about. There's a quote later that we talk about how it actually gets confusing to a lot of people, especially newcomers, what this is and how to make sure you have the right this in your components. So when you're using React hooks and pure components, this keyword just goes away. You don't use it. So the pure components, when they get new props or the props change, the component will re-render. So that's the one one of the two ways, right? And that's what we talked about with these guys up here. Is anytime the props changes, then you get notified, or the element will re-render. So with hooks, we basically have just one hook that we're using, UseState, and the UseState is like the most basic part, and it allows you to track state between renders without using a class. And so what happens when you call UseState, you pass it one argument, and the argument is either a value or a function. If you pass a value, which you'll see 99% of the time, it will set the initial state to that. So you might want to do like an object that has lots of properties in it. In this case, this state, all it is a empty string. So up here we had empty string, which is just this.state value. And that's just binding to the person's input as they type. So this component, all we care about is the string that they're typing. We start the string as empty string, and React UseState gives us two things that we can work with. One is the value at this time of this render, and two is a function to set the value. And this is where we're talking about hooking into something. We're hooking into the render pipeline by getting a function that we can call that will cause state to change and cause the element to be re-rendered. Right? So if the parent changes the props, it'll re-render. If anybody calls set value, in this case, the only person that calls set value is inside this function. But you call set value, it can be from an on-change event, it can be any other situation that might come up, set interval, whatever asynchronous event happens, then setting the value. In this case, we care about what the person just typed in, which is event target value. And then we set that value. And it feels like, well, nothing's happening. We didn't set this.state. We didn't cause anything to happen, but that's kind of the magic of the hooks, is calling a set value, hooks into the rendering pipeline and says, re-render this element with the new state. So the second time this element is rendered, it's not going to be this empty string. It's going to be whatever the user just typed in. And that will come in as value. So you'll have value change as they type and re-render every time they type something. That was kind of a lot. What questions do you guys have? Yeah.
What if you wanted to have multiple values? Like right there, you're only going to have one specific state. And you have one other object.
Yep. You are thinking just like this person. Is it this one? No, it's not this one. Let's look at, this one. So this is an example of many states. So you can do as many states as you want by UseState, and you can have a different state. And any one of these hooks or any one of these set state functions gets called. In this case, they're called set age, set fruit, set to-dos. If any of those get called, then the whole component will re-render. Does that make sense? So one thing that may be confusing too is this destructuring. So rather than return an object that has like state, and you'd have state.age and state.setState or something like that, you just get an array with two values that you can destructure and say, okay, I want to call the first one age, and I want to call the second setter set age. And so when you have three like this, it's nice because you can name them whatever you want. You can name them age, fruit, to-dos, right? I think in the last one we named it just value, right? It could be count, it could be any name you want to do allows you to do that. And then you don't have like this.state.age, you just have age. Other questions? This one, or?
I have one.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you don't have to check this later, but what about lifecycle?
Yeah, so that's a good point. We will talk about that later. So one of the things that you get inside of a class component with React is lifecycle methods. So the special methods that you name those in your class, like component will mount and component will unmount, component did update, all of those functions, they have equivalents that you can use. So it's really cool because you don't lose any of that, but you do get this more encapsulated way of doing it. So yeah, we'll get into that too. So I did want to read this real quick. I found this really interesting, which is kind of the impetus or the idea behind creating hooks. So in addition to making code reuse and code organization more difficult, we found, and this is the React team talking, that classes can be a large barrier to learning React. You have to understand how this works in JavaScript, which is very different from how it works in most languages. And you have to remember to bind the event handlers without certain syntax proposals. The code is very verbose. People can understand props, state, and top-down data flow perfectly, but still struggle with classes. The distinction between function and class components in React and when to use each one leads to disagreements even between experienced React developers. So it's about simplifying in some ways, right? We found that class components can encourage unintentional patterns that make optimizations fall back to a slower path. Classes present issues for today's tooling. They don't minify very well. Hot reloading is trickier. And it's just a simpler API to use functional components. So hooks lets you use more of React's features without classes. Conceptually, React components have always been closer to functions anyway, and hooks embrace functions, but without sacrificing the practical spirit of React. Hooks provide access to imperative escape hatches and don't require you to learn complex functional or reactive programming techniques. Any questions on that? I thought it was a pretty interesting motivation, and I also liked how within a month or so of, well, I think it was probably more like a week, that the very first hooks beta came out, that Evan Yu of the Vue team demonstrated how you would use the hooks concept with Vue. And I think people have done similar kinds of proof of concepts for Angular too. So this concept isn't specifically for React. The idea of having these ability to hook into different functionality from somewhere else is really kind of having to do with data binding more than a specific library. So it's interesting that we have come upon it. So here's going to your question about the component lifecycle methods. So component did update. So this example is saying, okay, what I want to do is I want to store my items in session when they change, so that the session always has the latest value that the user has typed in. So at the beginning, you get the item that was last there, when they came to the page last, or an empty string if they've never been there. And every time that the component updates, you want to set the value into storage, or write it into storage. So basically the same function we looked at before, but there's this situation where your local storage set and get. And notice how those kind of go, those things are really tightly coupled, right? They're very same kind of thing, writing to the local storage and reading from the local storage, and yet they're in two different functions here. So that's one thing that we're trying to kind of simplify, is get them right next to each other. And then also we'll see that you can reuse them outside of a certain component. So in this example, you're doing the UseState and having the default local storage, and then this thing called useEffect. So UseEffect is used for multiple types of these lifecycle hooks. In this case, the UseEffect, the first parameter is a function to run in certain cases. The second parameter is an array to indicate what cases it'll run. So in this case, it runs anytime value changes. So anytime the user has typed, this UseEffect will cause this function to run. You'll also see a common of an empty array, which basically means run at the start. And then the UseEffect also has a way to tap into the will unmount situation. So similar kinds of code, but now we've put these next to each other. And even more than that, I think what it comes down, yeah, right here, it says what you can do is you can create your own hook. So your own hook is UseState with local storage. So what you're doing is you're creating a reusable piece that gets whatever thing is in local storage and passes it to the state. And every time the state changes, it saved it to local storage. So here's this reusable thing that anytime you want to save state to local storage, you can just include this function. So obviously you'd put this in another file and you'd be able to reuse it whenever you want. And it's just a function. It's a little, we don't have the parentheses, but it is a function. The way you would use the function is similar. UseState with local storage is the name that we created for this reusable piece. And we're just giving it a value, which is like the key or the name, because we just learned about local storage. So that's good timing there. So when you've got this included here, you'll notice that inside of hooks that you create, you can use React hooks. So that way you can use the state and the effects or the lifecycle methods inside your hook, and that's what it really does. So basically we get this value and set value from the UseState, and we actually just return that same thing. You could return a different set value or value. You could return something completely different that has nothing to do with state, but it could do that. So for example, you could have UseState with debugging, and every time the state changes, you debug to a console or to an API or something like that. You could create your own hook with that. Any questions on this guy? Cool. Okay, let's see. Next one, we're going to look at yeah, so we talked about this using many states. Talked about creating your own hook. Talked about the effect hook. And people have actually made hooks that you can get on NPM that are called like use component will unmount, or component did mount, or component did update, in case, because it's because it might be confusing to figure out how to use effect properly. Let's see. So here's another example. This is a component called friend status, and you're using the state. You're handling the state change. You're using an effect, which is some chat API that you're subscribing and unsubscribing. So you can see here with this use effect, the first, and I thought you had to have the second parameter be an empty array, but anyway, if you had an empty array here, it would just be like run once, run the first time that this is going to mount. So it's kind of like component will mount, or no, it's component did mount. So this will run right after the component mounts, and then when you return something to UseEffect, when you return something out of the UseEffect function, then you return a function that will be called when the component unmounts. So that's your will unmount lifecycle hook. And then let's see. Yeah, so it's not gonna, it doesn't show here, but the idea with this is that you could take all this code and move it outside of the hook. And you can just reuse it. Like anytime you want chat API stuff, you can put right in, make a hook for using the chat API. Any questions? Yeah.
The question is a clarification. When you're using UseState, use effect without the second parameter, it's going to run always. So the first time it's going to run the chat API, but then the second time that it re-renders, it's going to run first the unsubscribe form first, the friends, and then subscribe again. That is the difference. So when you're passing an empty array, it's going to making sure that the first one is calling on the subscribe method is calling on the mount.
Okay.
And the second one, the unsubscribe is calling on the unmount method.
Okay. See, and there's a reason to use those hooks that say use component did mount and will unmount, because it's easy to get wrong. Let's see, does it show? No, it doesn't show one, but you'd move it. So there's a couple of rules with hooks, like you can't call them inside loops, conditions, or nested functions, and you can only call it from function components. You can't call it from class components. So basically, if you went 100% hooks, which you can make your whole app with just pure functions and hooks, then you don't even need to worry about classes. It is. I did find it interesting, though, that React said that they have no plans to ever remove the class syntax, because this is, in some ways, it's just sugar on top, so it's not really a totally different system. It's just the same system written in a different way. Let's see. Oh, okay. So here it is. Here's the use friend status. So they've created their own hook. As you can see, it has a lot of the functions, but now you have this reusable use friend status that you can use in any component, and it will encapsulate all this information about the chat API and handling the online and everything like that. So in this one, we saw one that returned the value and set value. In this case, it's just returning is online. So when you use the friend status, the component, all it needs to know is if you're online. The trick is to know if someone's online. There's all this more complicated stuff like subscribing to the chat API. So that's kind of cool that you can just put that in a hook, and then anytime you want to know the friend status, all you do is use friend status function. And so your friend status component now changes. So if you were just using the friend status, so this might be, for example, you can imagine you are on Facebook and you click into a certain friend and you see their detail page and you want to know if they're online or not. This friend status right here maybe displays online or offline, and it gets the based on the current friend that we're talking about. And so it can, if online equals null, then loading. Otherwise, then it's either true or false, and we're going to decide to show online or offline. And then it also talks about how you can, let's see, what's different here? Friend list. Oh, it's just showing another component that you would use the friend status, and how you could, now you have two components. They would have had either duplicated code, or you would have had to figure out some way to get some class and instantiate it, or get a singleton to figure that out. But instead, it's just this reusable hook. There's some other hooks that you can get into that are not used as much. The main two we covered are UseState and UseEffect. There's also UseContext, which accesses the new context API. There's UseReducer, which allows you to define functions that you can dispatch the different actions. Let's see. Yeah, so it also talks about, like I mentioned, there's no plans to remove classes, but you can gradually adopt function components with hooks. Like your application can have both classes and functional components with hooks. You just can't have classes with hooks. Okay, so let's look at some of the ideas here. Make this bigger. Okay. So there's a few of these around, and I wrote my own just to kind of get a feel for it. But this is a hook called UseFetch. So what's really cool about this is we say, okay, here's the library URL. This is just an open API that you can search for CDN.js. And so there's just one piece of state that I'm tracking, which is the search term that somebody types in here. So if you start typing LO, then I'm going to get Lodash and other things like that. And so the UseFetch, what it does is, in this case, I've made it so that it passes params. So it's a GET request, but the params, so it would be like, the URL is /libraries. So if I was doing a GET request, what it's actually pulling is fields equals description author, right? And then this UseFetch hook that I created gives you several things that you can work with. Like this config, I don't need it, but it returns it. So the data would be whatever data has been fetched. And is loading, true or false. It tells you if the fetch is in progress. And ability to set config, which will allow us to set set the search term. So let's see, down here we have set config, and we give the config and then new search term and debounce. So one thing that I really like about something like this is I was actually talking to Brett Little at Canopy, and he was talking about how when they first started using React, that one thing that was really tricky was API requests that were in flight and had never finished, and then the component it was attached to unmounted. So it was a really kind of situation where it's not straightforward how you would handle that in React. Well, what's cool is with the UseFetch, so let's look at the definition of UseFetch here. So I care about 3 pieces of state: the config, which is like the config we're passing to document.fetch, the data that's returned from document.fetch, and is loading, if it's loading or not. And then this is new to document fetch. You might not have seen the abort controller, but this basically gives you a token where you can abort the request. So with XHR requests back in the day, if you just use, well, I mean, people still use them, they're not bad. There is an abort method, so you can abort the XHR anytime you want. With document fetch, you have to do it this way, which is creating an abort controller and calling that. But what's cool is with this use effect, you can just say, if this unmounts, and this is any component that's using this UseFetch hook, if that particular component unmounts, then run this function, which is to abort, right? And then you don't have to worry about these long-running queries or whatever it is. Maybe it's not long-running, but people are clicking around really quickly, and so all of these data requests are in flight, and they come back, and UI doesn't know where to put the data. So this kind of takes care of that. So it'll abort that. So, and then I also added in this feature of a debounce, which basically says wait for them to start typing a little bit. So you can see, it starts type and let's see, something like that. So each time I type a letter, it's waiting to see if I type another letter in 150 milliseconds. And if I don't, it does a fetch. And it's fetching based on this, which is the fields and the search term. So CDM.js API takes the fields, and then it also takes search, which will filter and search. And so all the view part of the component is here. Basically just saying, here's the input, and if there's data, and there's data results, then for each of the data results, then render the library item, which all it is this link and the description text. And if it's loading, then you just type, or just show loading. So I think we can, for example, come into network and turn the throttling to slow 3G, maybe? Let's try that. And let's type in low dash. Libraries. Okay, now we got it saving. Libraries. Okay. So you can see it's really slow. It's loading. So we get to see this loading message here. And you can see the other cool thing about it is, well, let me make this a little bit bigger. So I typed some letters and it canceled the fetch because of the debounce. But also if I were to unmount that, like go to a different page or whatever, it would also cancel the fetch. So here's another, let's see, so another thing that's interesting about hooks is they're functional. So let's go back and look at one of the simple hooks. Let's see. So with the simple, because these are just functions, you can just, when you're unit testing them, you can just call them as functions and see what gets returned. And that could be your unit test and your set, right? So it's really simple because, again, you get to completely isolate the things that you're working on and test them separately. So this, okay, so here's another one. Another point. There's this idea that in React parlance you can add, what would they be called? Modifier? No. Decorators? When you say with merging. So anything that starts with kind of augments a function or a class. And in this case, what we're doing is we're saying we're going to use state like normally we would, but we're passing it through this with merging function, which will change the way we set state. So the with merging, it's not a hook. It just modifies any old function. In this case, it's modifying something with a hook. It gets the state that was passed in, and it creates a new set state, which basically allows you to automatically do the states, to merge the state. So, for example, in this case, we have two things in our state, count and enabled. So the enabled controls the checkbox, and the count controls the plus and minus. And So right here, you can see to decrement, we just passed the count, and it's going to automatically merge that with the existing state, and that will keep the enabled. Even though we're not putting enabled in here, it's going to keep the enabled because it's going to merge them together. And same thing with enabled. When we change enabled, all we have to pass is enabled, but it'll retain that count. So that's an example of how, because React hooks are just functions, you can totally change the way they work by just creating another function. An extreme case of this that I did just for kicks is this pipe operator. And pipe is basically the same thing as calling, one thing and then outer and then out, like more and more functions around each other. So basically the thing in the middle, or the thing that we're modifying, is UseState. And so this UseState, in this case, we're using an object that has properties limit page and foo. And we can, with that state, we can pass it through several different functions. This one is called with analytics. So with analytics function, we're going to create a version of with analytics function that has the first argument as limit, the second argument as limit was set to, and then the third argument will be the result of UseState. Same thing with, you could have a minimum. So if you have, let's see, what's a minimum? How do we do? I can't remember. Let's see. Page must be greater than 0. So if we do that, if we try to go to previous page, we're on page 0. This thing is in the pipeline, or in modifying the use state, and it can tell you, something like page must be greater than 0. And it doesn't actually, it can't actually stop it. You'd have to create another hook to actually stop it. So that's an example. Oh, and then like a form validator. I don't think that'd be a good way to do it, but the idea is that you can have other things happen. And you can either make your custom hooks, or you can do stuff to modify a hook. Let's see. So here is a bigger example. So this is showing some posts, and there's two views. There's a list view and a grid view. And there is a filter where you can do, some kind of filter. And you can see that these are siblings. You've got the toolbar, the count, and the area are siblings. So you might ask, well, how, when you type in here, does the sibling get to find out about the filter that you just typed in? Well, you can use React context, or you can even just use hooks. There's several hooks out there for a global state or a shared state, and I created one where you can see there's a state that all of these pieces share. This one knows and only cares about the count of stories. This one displays the stories. This one actually just shows the JSON representation, and this one shows just a count of how many times things have re-rendered. So, or how many times the state has been modified. So if we look in the way it is written, so story toolbar. So story toolbar uses, so I created a hook called useStore, and I created a story store, and in the story store it returns the current state, it returns actions that have been defined by the store, and a reset, which allows us to have this reset button. So basically what we have here is the list button, the grid button, the input, and the reset. And as you can see, this function, the only thing it has in it is JSX and this UseStore. So this is an example of how you could use a store or context to put all of your view changing logic completely outside of your pure component. In this case, we have, in response to the on-click, we have the actions show list. So in this story store, which we'll show you in a minute, it has functions for show list, show grid, search, and reset. So let's go into and see how those work. So here's a story store. This is the, there's some fake data you could get from Ajax or whatever. It's just data to use for these posts. And this is my initial state, and these are my action functions. And I'm exporting the story store. And the create store function just takes the state that you want and the actions that you want. And you can see what a action looks like. It gets a state parameter, and it returns the new state. And in this case, the thing that's changing is the list or the grid. And because we have the ellipses state here, we are spreading, and we get to it doesn't affect stories or search term or unused. And then the search function, that one just goes through each story and filters out the ones that match, and it returns a new state. And so this is an interesting way that you could create your state altering functions in one file and unit test those completely separate from how your views work. So you would have a, you would export these three functions, and then you can test. You can just say, okay, show list. I'm going to call that with some random object. Let's say it's an empty object, and then I'm just going to assert that it now is not empty and that has view equal to list. And there you go. You got unit testing for something that's functional, that has nothing to do with how you display the data or how you do attach listeners or anything like that. You can also unit test that, and you can do it separately, but you don't need to test them together if you don't want. Any other questions? That's pretty much all I have. Anything else you want me to cover? What's that? Oh, yeah. Let's look at that. So this hook, basically the way that I do this one, let me show using the store. So basically what it says is, okay, we have one store and it's global, and it just sits there dormant until one of the components exists and is trying to use it. And when one of the components use it, all it does is subscribe. So when this component is first mounted, this story toolbar first mounted, then it subscribes to that store and it cares about that store. And anytime that toolbar is unmounted, it unsubscribes. So if you have no more subscribers to the store just sits there, and it's until you want to use it again. And so this one basically says, when you use a store, you care about this state and set state functions, which allow you to hook into the component and make it re-render that particular component. So anytime any of the components have some kind of state change, this state will change for each component, and then it will re-render. And so the store, defining the store, you basically set the initial state, the actions. There's a reset, which is just set all of the, well, kind of glance over it, but when you subscribe, you give your components or your hooks set state function, and that's what it can use to set state. So when you type in here, basically it's calling the set state function for every single one of these components, and so each component gets the new state. And I'm not an expert, but there's tons of out there if you want to use something that you can list of React hooks. Collection of React hooks. So there's this really long thing, gives you an idea. So like here's similar to what I created, use abortable fetch. You know, you can have one that's use toggle. So all that does is allow you to have like a is true, and then it has like a toggle and a set function. What other good examples? Some get really specific with like Apollo queries. Use audio, that's pretty interesting. Allows you to just play some audio clips. Use Axios, similar to the use fetch we looked at, but it's for Axios if you use that. There's even things like this, which is just an asynchronous API called the battery status API. And if you want to know the battery status, you can say use battery, and anytime the battery percentage drops, then your component will re-render. Let's see what else. Oh, use click outside. Use a counter. Use CSS, which allows you to put a CSS URL, and it will load that CSS. And then on unmount, it will remove that CSS. Use dark mode. I looked at that. There's a new API property of the CSS, which is does the user prefer dark mode, which is mostly Mac. I think Windows is coming out with a dark mode too. I don't know, but anyway, the browser can tell you if it prefers dark mode. So you can. I think this has a demo. Let's see. What is it supported by? I think it's supported by Chrome too, but anyway, the example is that you have this toggle button to change dark mode, but the idea is that the dark mode, the initial dark mode is what the browser setting is. So let's see. What is it? It is, yeah, it's a media query called it's like prefers dark mode. I think it might be in this other function, but is that it? Yeah. System has requested the light or dark color scheme. It can be no preference, light or dark, and browser support is Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. So that's kind of cool that you can like pull out the and if they changed their preference in the middle of using their website, then your website, then the website could change. Anyway. Any other questions before I finish? So if you haven't used hooks before, hopefully you can experiment with them and try them out. Like I said, you can use them in any app right now that is on the latest React. I think it's 16.8, and or is that right? Okay. So you have to make sure you're up to that, but then you can just use it alongside whatever React app you have. So hopefully you'll try it out. Thanks so much.